Well, just 2 days ago, French President Emmanuel Macron gave an interview in which he said that Europe should not get involved in a conflict between the United States and China if tensions over Taiwan increase. It was part of a longer interview, which he used to call for more European sovereignty. Well, today, Macron outlined his vision for Europe and what that sovereignty should stand on. He noted that the pandemic and the war in Ukraine provide instructions of what needs to change. Some of what he said won't be easy listening for France's closest allies.
Those who decided to cooperate, to make trade with neighbors, even if they were not allies, Russia, for energy. Because we decided, de facto, that trade could be the best way to cooperate, could create irreversible links and precisely avoid the others to be aggressive. They decided to weaponize the energy, putting us in a completely crazy and unbelievable situation. Pandemic and war just pushed us in a situation to discover that we have to reduce our dependencies if you want to preserve the European identity. Otherwise, we will progressively be dependent on everything.
Students in The Hague eagerly awaited the French president's key address. Over the weekend, Macron had given an interview that had drawn attention due to his remarks about Taiwan and the threat of conflict between the U.S. and China. The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must be followers and must adapt ourselves to an American rhythm and a Chinese overreaction. This raised the question whether his views were in line with the EU's position. His later speech seemed more cautious in spite of its grand flourishes.
This is why European sovereignty is not just a concept or a fantasy, but it's absolutely, in a dangerous world, a necessity.
Over Easter, Beijing's military exercises in waters off Taiwan demonstrated just how dangerous the global situation is. But other Europeans draw different conclusions to Macron. The fact that he sides with China and against America at the very moment when military exercises are taking place on Taiwan's borders does not align with European interests. Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki stressed that the relationship to the U.S. is critical to Poland's security. And one U.S. senator said what many conservative Americans think.
We need to ask Europe, does he speak for them? Because we're pretty heavily involved in Ukraine right now. We're spending a lot of our taxpayer money on a European war.
Emmanuel Macron has given Europe fresh impetus, but not everyone is pleased with the direction he's taking.
Let's bring in correspondent Christine Mundwa, who is joining us from Brussels. Christine, what was Macron's main message, you think?
Well, his main message in the speech he gave in The Hague yesterday was to say that Europe is way too dependent on other world powers and that needed to change. He referred to the pandemic as having had been an eye-opener, how Europe was stuck experiencing supply shortages, semiconductors. He also referred to the fact that war was back in Europe and that Europeans needed a common defense and security. So what he would have said yesterday in that speech, many would agree with, that Europe indeed needs to further integrate and to be more independent, more sovereign. And he said it was important so that Europe could be a rule maker rather than just a rule taker in a changing world. So that was his main message yesterday. And of course, it wasn't just the students in The Hague listening out in that speech yesterday to see if he would make further remarks about what he had said on Taiwan. It was the press too. And sad to say, we were disappointed in a sense.
Tell us a little bit more about that because, as you mentioned, so many people were watching to see if there was anything that he would say to reassure those unsettled by his recent remarks on Taiwan.
Yeah, so not in yesterday's speech, not at all. And of course, it wasn't a press conference, so to say, where we as a press could have further pressed him on that. But what is clear is that for a lot of people, what's really unsettling by his remarks was his way of almost equating Beijing and Washington by saying that we shouldn't be followers of China and we shouldn't be followers of the United States, especially in Eastern European countries where the U.S.'s security reassurance is really important for the foundation of their peace and security, again, especially in the context that we're in now where there is a war in Europe. So it is this seemingly equating China and and the United States that a lot of people would have felt uncomfortable with. I think, in large part, people do agree, as we heard from, for example, the European Council President Charles Michel, that Europe must be more independent in a position where it's able to make its own decisions. But I think it is this idea that he would be turning on an ally, as we heard from the German MEP there, that he would be siding with Beijing, because really these remarks have been welcomed in Beijing. A lot of local outlets in China reporting, rallying and hailing these remarks as refreshing from an independent individual.
The speech interrupted by protesters at one point. Tell us more about that.
Well, President Macron is in his second term, and he's really facing the biggest challenge of his second term back home. That is, of course, his efforts to reform France's pension system, which will see the retirement age go from 62 to 64. We have seen, and we've been reporting on the mass protests that have been happening across the country in France. And of course, before he started his speech, you had hecklers shouting, where is French democracy, and that you are a president of hypocrisy and violence. And of course, he went on to rebuff that to say, well, the very fact that this could happen shows that we're in a democracy, and said we should not be equating our countries, Western democracies, to places in the world where there really is no democracy. So it's really just those issues back home catching up with him as he goes on the international stage, where he largely receives, as we saw in Beijing and also here in The Hague, where he's spending time with the king and other senior leaders, big receptions.
Christine Mundwa in Brussels, thank you.
All right, I want to bring in Jacob Ross now. He is the Alfred Oppenheim Center for the Future of Europe. With that center, that is an organization looking at how the European Union can become more strategic in its decisions and actions, and what this would require from Germany. He joins me tonight from Paris. It's good to have you with us. When we hear the French president there talking about those who bought Russian energy being the ones who weaponized energy, I'm wondering, how is that going to go down here in Berlin?
Well, it's certainly heard, and it's a criticism that has been heard, as you can imagine, a lot throughout the past month. That has been heard a lot since Russia's renewed aggression against Ukraine back in February of last year. And I think it's some kind of reflex that is an answer as well to the criticism that France and that President Macron have suffered after his remarks on China, on the US and their relationship, and the role of Europe in this relationship towards Taiwan.
Yeah, Jacob, let me pick up on what he said about China, Taiwan. This speech, it came just a couple of days after Macron's Politico interview, saying Europe should not get mixed up in a conflict between the US and China. Is he looking for a future in which France does not have to pick sides?
That's a good question. I don't think that, and that was a very common interpretation of his remarks in the Politico and Les Echos interview, that France was somehow putting China and the US on par, that these relationships should be equal for France and the European Union. I don't think that's what President Macron meant. But yes, I think that he wanted to underline that the French position and the position of the European Union vis-à-vis China and the US was a position of strength, of independence in this mounting conflict between these two blocs or superpowers, blocs as the French and Macron call it, and that the European Union should be careful not to be dragged into a conflict. It has no particular stakes in. That's what he said, and that's what spurred massive criticism, including in Berlin and in Germany.
I'm wondering if we give too much weight to the words of Macron. Do you think we, the media, or all of us in general, are we guilty of treating Macron as if he were the president of the European Union?
No, I don't think so. I think that, and this came out in the previous interview, that Macron is one of the most senior leaders within the European Union now. Now that Angela Merkel, Germany's past chancellor, is gone, he's one of the leading voices in Europe, and he has a very disruptive style in his political communication. he made proof of that in the past. It was it has been a hard thing for allies to cope with in the past. Let's remember 2019 when he called NATO brain dead. So I think it's part of his style of communication, of politics, that he wants to push this debate forward by choosing very stark words and very, a very aggressive discourse, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely provoked with his prose, if you will. We have to remind ourselves, I think, as well, that Germany is deeply tied to transatlanticism. Poland's prime minister calls the alliance with the United States an absolute foundation of European security. Is there anything then in Macron's vision that would appeal to Germany and to Poland?
Well, I think that his deep conviction that the European Union needs to be strengthened and first and foremost in security and defense is something that is shared both in Berlin and in Warsaw. The means to do that is probably the point of contention, but I think fundamentally what Macron is aiming at is strengthened Europe with regards to Russia, with regards to China, and also with regards to the US, I think is something that is largely shared within Europe. The problem being that his style of communication, his vocabulary, strategic autonomy, European sovereignty is at times misunderstood, misinterpreted, and that his timing is frankly poor. I mean, the fact that he came out with these comments flying back from his visit with Xi, and just hours later, Chinese military started maneuvering around Taiwan, was just a very, very poor signal and perceived as such both in the US and in the European Union.
Jakob, do you think we could see Macron now as being damaged goods for the rest of Europe? He's not going to run for election again, and we know that he's taken a hit by all of these protests over his plans to reform the country's pension system.
Yes, I think so, at least in the short term. He has clearly done damage to the message of Western unity, first of all, of transatlantic unity. I think that part of this is probably some kind of revenge that has to be beared in mind for what happened again in 2021 with the AUKUS deal, when France was excluded from the submarine deals. The US, well, that's the French reading at least, stabbed France in the back in this region. And I think Macron's comments on the relationship between the US, China, and the European Union is at least an echo to that. But yes, I think he has done damage, and we will see, hopefully, if this debate, as did the brain dead comments, will spur a healthy and helpful debate for the European Union going forward.
Yeah, we will see, that is for sure. Jakob Ross with the Alfred Oppenheim Center for the Future of Europe. Jakob, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.